Hello, good evening and welcome to BizFirst Review 360, your weekly roundup of the top business news and developments impacting the economy. This week has been quite topsy-turvy in the country, at least politically. We've seen some drastic shake-ups in the Cabinet of Ministers, specifically with the Ministry of National Policies and Economic Affairs, which falls under the purview of the Prime Minister. The President has removed the Central Bank of Sri Lanka and the Securities and Exchange Commission from the National Policies Ministry and placed it under the purview of the Finance Ministry. What does this mean politically, and how will it impact the country in terms of business and economics? Let's take a look at this week's top stories.
Premier Ranil Wickremesinghe, welcoming the entry of the Bank of China to Sri Lanka, said it marks a new chapter in modern economic relations between the two countries.
The opening of the Colombo branch of the Bank of China is another important step in building a strong economy. It shows that in the last 3 years we have been successful in that we have one of the largest banks in the world, the Bank of China, to come to Sri Lanka and to commence business. It's a new chapter in the modern economic history of Sri Lanka and China.
The launch of Bank of China is said to be the fourth largest bank in the world, with assets of $2.7 trillion took place at Shangri-La, Colombo. Prime Minister said that the government has stabilized the economy and the entry of the bank can help boost Chinese investment in the island.
And certainly the Bank of China has an important role to play, both in making finances, making credit available to Sri Lankan enterprises operating in Sri Lanka, as much as you can help us with bringing Chinese investment into Sri Lanka. And your presence here will strengthen our case to become a financial center.
Central Bank Governor Dr. Indrajit Kumaraswamy, addressing the gathering, said Bank of China can play a vital role to help Sri Lankan business link up with supply chains, boost manufacturing and industrial activity.
The effort to link medium and small size companies into cross-border production sharing networks, i.e. supply chains, the industrialization of Sri Lanka, as we're all aware, the manufacturing sector has not been as buoyant as it could have been in terms of contributing to the development of the country. The Bank of China is very well placed to support the industrial zone in the Hambantota area and also manufacturing industry beyond, and it will help our manufacturing companies to leverage relatively cheap capital and longer-term capital because of the financial clout that the Bank of China wields.
United States announced the restoration of the US GSP scheme, enabling duty-free Sri Lankan exports to the US market. President Donald Trump reauthorized the US GSP facility for 120 beneficiary countries. According to the Ministry of Industry and Commerce, the scheme will be effective from the 22nd of April. This initiative greatly strengthens relations with our biggest trade partner in the world and helps not only our exporters but US importers and US consumers as well, Minister of Industry and Commerce Rishad Bathiuddin said in a statement. The reauthorization will open opportunities for around 5,000 products to be imported to the US without tariff from 120 developing countries, including Sri Lanka. The facility will benefit developing countries until the 31st of December 2020. The Ministry of Industry and Commerce said Sri Lankan exports to the US are now almost at the $3 billion threshold for the first time, up 3.65% from the $2.8 billion recorded in 2016. Logistics and Transport marked 5 years in existence at a celebration conference themed Press for Progress by Sustainable Logistics and Transport.
Originally, when we founded Bilat, what we did was, the awareness in our industry was very low about the career opportunities. If you really look at the statistics, we have only 3% women in logistics and transport, right? So that's pretty small, right? So the first task that we had was to how do we really get more women into the industry. That was a sticky floor part that we tried to address before we go and try to break the glass ceiling, right? So the first task was that. So we did a lot of programs to create awareness among the young girls and especially among the parents and all that, some of the career guidance programs through that we have done that. The second thing that we did was those who are already in the industry, we had to retain them because there are a lot of challenges that women go through in their career life cycle, because when you start a family you take a break and once you come back, so there are a lot of challenges you need to juggle between your work and professional life, personal life. So that was the second part which we did. The third phase of our activities were that how do we engage more male advocates, because without all of you guys we cannot go on this journey, right? So we both have complementary skill sets. We bring a different skill set to the table and it will be synergistic and we can both together create value to organizations. So in that regard, we partnered with UN Women, and what we did was we got all the companies. We actually first asked our male supporters to come and sign up for UN Women He for She campaign. That was in 2015. We actually got a lot of support from the male advocates in the industry, and then we went on. We didn't stop at that. The next year, that was in 2017, what we did was we actually reached out to companies and asked them to sign up for the CEO commitment for women empowerment principles of UN Women He for She campaign. So we are encouraged by the support that we got. All top companies in this country have signed up for that.
The event was attended by the International President of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, Kevin Byrne, and Chairman of its Sri Lanka chapter.
Has the logistics sector in Sri Lanka kept pace with port-related infrastructure development? We hear from the Global President of the Chartered Institute of Logistics.
Seeing all the port development and other infrastructure development going on in Sri Lanka, do you think the logistic and transport sector has kept pace?
I think so. The thing about when you develop something, be it at the airport or the port or even in terms of public transport, you need lots of investment, and sometimes a small country can't afford it, so it does things that are very wise, as is the case in my own country, where we have a thing called the public partnership, and that's a very good thing, because you can get somebody in who knows what the return is going to be. They will perhaps put in the money required to expand your port or your airport, or if you're putting in, for example, a light rail or some such thing like that. It is the way to go. It means the taxpayer doesn't have to pick up the entire bill. The engineering skills are there to do the job and do the work, and you can bring in then a company that knows what it's going to get in return over the next 20 or 25 years, and then usually the actual the item that has been built, the structure, as it were, the infrastructure, returns to the state ownership, and that is a very good thing in the short term and in the long term.
How do you see the current situation with regard to our southern deepwater port in Hambantota? The Chinese have, taken over the operations. Do you think that will help Sri Lanka progress in its ambition to become a hub?
If anybody can, probably a private ownership like in Chinese hands can do that. What is interesting, I suppose, from the point of view of this being an island nation, there is competition out there, because we were in a place like Mauritius just a couple of years ago, ago on one of our annual visits, and they gave us a very good technical reason why they should become the hub in the Indian Ocean, and there are competitors on different coastlines not too far from here. But like aviation, I think you can grow the market if the price is right. I mean, I come from a place where, for example, we have a low-cost airline, and it's carrying 110 million passengers with over 400 aircraft in that regard in different places. If the price is right and people can make a profit, there can be business for everybody. It does not need to be a cartel in any sense of that word.
What are global trends in terms of shipping and logistics? Do you think we'll see more alliances in the future? What is the trend like? And how will it be challenging for small economies like Sri Lanka?
Well, it's interesting because what is coming in now is IT is going to rule everything. It has to do with the way ships are moved, the way vehicles are moved, the way aircraft are moved. IT projects will take over. I don't mean that they'll drive the ships themselves, you know, there is a market to do that. But the efficiencies driven will be done by IT. Information technology is king from that point of view. There's no need to fear it. If you embrace it fairly early and get on top of the job, as it were, you will not be left behind from that point of view. The other point is that we must consider the environment in all things logistics, and that is a huge feature at the moment. I was at a lecture earlier today about how fuel oils are polluting the air from some points of view, and that logistics itself puts so many percentage points into the air. We have to think of the future. We have to think of replacing fossil fuels. In the short term, in terms of shipping and aviation, we're still going to use liquid fuels for the foreseeable future because there's no alternative at the moment. And I'm optimistic that things will go well. An island nation such as Sri Lanka will have to and will respond to the threats and to the opportunities that arise in the immediate future.
Do you see operations moving out of Europe and East Asia to countries like Sri Lanka, where the logistic industry also could, you know, gain more business?
It's possible, but of course we're all looking at a thing called the One Belt, One Road, which is a very, very large, I presume it's a, what would you call, a campaign by China to move goods across land and through different routes that they don't at the moment. That is getting some success, and I suspect that what is being built here in Colombo has some element of that, and the port perhaps to the south of the island is involved in that as well. One Belt, One Road will change some of the way things are done between Europe and Asia generally, I think, and it'll be more efficient. It may cost less money, but it will be there for the future. So we must look at all aspects of logistics in the frame of China's idea of One Belt, One Road.
You mentioned that it would change some of the things in the future. Can you elaborate a bit on it?
Yeah, just the routes that are taken now. The fact that, for example, trains go now overland between China and Germany, that would be unthinkable as much as 5 years ago now. But I've seen video of a train which is 2.5 kilometres long, quite an extraordinary piece of architecture. It's very efficient. It will take containers off the sea from that point of view because you can keep the train going for 7 days in a row if required. It's more secure allegedly, and it doesn't have any of the elements involved in you know, the costs involved in shipping, and it's one, you lock it on the train in one place and you unload it somewhere else. That is, as I said, for slow cargo it's a very vital thing to do. I think it will become extremely popular, and other countries will want to get a piece of the action, as it were, in that regard.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time.
Welcome back to the program. What are the biggest obstacles facing the economic reform agenda in Sri Lanka? Is it merely a lack of political will? Is it the lack of popular support? To discuss this and more, we're joined by Kitmina Hewage and Harini Veerasekara from the Institute of Policy Studies. Thank you both for being on the program today. Let me start off by asking you, the two of you have co-authored this paper, Economic Reforms in Sri Lanka, Salvation or a Recipe for Inaction. Kitmina, what prompted this undertaking at this point of time?
Thanks, Sandeep, for having us. There are several reasons as to why this paper and all this research was important. One is that right now the government, as well as the economy in general, is moving towards a reform agenda. They have adopted a reform agenda, one based on a change in government that happened in 2015, but also in terms of international intervention and kind of what the international community has recommended through the IMF intervention and so on. So basically the government has identified that there is a need for reform, rightly so, and that reform agenda has faced some political backlash, as usual in Sri Lankan in the political system. And the important part was that when we look back on in post-independent Sri Lanka, we keep coming across this, where governments keep coming up with economic reform agendas, but there seems to be certain
this is where I wonder why there is a political backlash to it, because when it comes to many of these reforms, there is no political ideology there is no division in political ideology in this. This is accepted as these are the basic reforms that you need to undertake, no matter what your ideological sort of lens you're looking at it through. So we've seen even in the previous government, which promoted itself as a more socialist government, there were calls for this sort of reform. And as you quite rightly mentioned, this has been there throughout successive governments, regardless of which political party was the founding base of that government. Why do you think that we come across this stumbling block of political backlash over and over again?
So that's what was interesting in terms of what we come up with, the three reasons that we come up with. They don't have to do with political ideology. It's the three things are institutional misalignment, misidentified reforms, and a lack of data. And these are structural and institutional issues rather than political issues. So it was, even though we tend to think of backlash to reforms in terms of the political lens, what we found was that it's a more structural and institutional issue that can be solved a lot easier than kind of hitting it down the park and kind of blaming everything on politics per se.
Harley, in your paper you identify institutional misalignment as one of the key factors when it comes to the failure of the economic reform, or the failure in undertaking economic reforms in Sri Lanka. You also referred to a very interesting snapshot of the public sector: 52 ministries, 21 state ministries, 341 state-owned enterprises, a workforce of about 1.36 million, and the problem is that a lot of these people are doing each other's work. There's a lot of duplication in the public sector. How do you go about fixing this? What are the, how do you reform the public sector in such a toxic environment?
Yeah, so like you rightly said, our public sector is very complex and kind of chaotic at the moment, in the sense that there are several departments which are doing duplicative work under different ministries. If you take, for example, the agricultural sector, you'll have 5 different agencies dealing with, say, the coconut sector, and another 6 dealing with tea. So obviously in such a situation, coordination is an issue, and in order to bridge this, what we feel is that there should be a more governance-based institutional structure as opposed to an issue-based structure. So what we mean by this is that there's a tendency for ministerial portfolios and institutions to be structured around issues that pop up, emerging issues. But rather than this, it should be in response to or rather aligned with kind of subject-based structure. So for instance, in Singapore and the US, you have a system of sort of having limited clusters, or say education, labor, health, and so on. And under each of these blocks, everything related to that particular subject will be dealt with. So under the education ministry, you will deal with tertiary education, primary education, religious education, and so on. Whereas in Sri Lanka, it's kind of all scattered across several different portfolios. So a solution that was actually suggested to this issue, which was actually picked up by us in an article written by Dr. Sujata Gamage from Learn Asia, is given that this is a reality that you kind of have to contend with in developing countries, bloated public sectors and messy institutional structures, is you take the existing kind of fragmented bodies and group them under kind of core subject areas or clusters, and ensure that at least within these clusters there is more coordination and avoidance of kind of duplicating mandates, at least among people who are tasked to do similar
that sounds, if it can be achieved, sounds great. Unfortunately, we have the sort of a political system where from time to time even the powers that be are compelled to for example, place lotteries under the foreign ministry, or cluster together highways and higher education. How do you get beyond that sort of stumbling block? What can we do to ensure that this kind of thing doesn't happen? Is it purely through legislation?
One thing is legislation in terms of kind of codifying how to do things, and I think that's seen in the US where the cabinet portfolios are very concrete, and that's how things work. But I think the more important part is information and education in terms of the public who vote for those policymakers. And if there is enough pressure from the public in terms of ensuring that there is more efficiency, then I think it seeps into the policy making process as well. And secondly, thirdly, I think it's important that from the structural point of view, there is better identification of those misalignments from the bureaucrats. So not just the policymakers and the public, but there is a middle sector as well, and those are the bureaucrats, those are who are in the ministry, who are doing the work. I think it's important that they also recognize and then work accordingly and make sure that there are internal structures that can work through those.
Do you feel that you're asking a lot of people who are very resistant to change to embrace some very drastic changes?
Well, we love comparing ourselves to Singapore, and we love comparing wanting to be the next Singapore. So if we want to be the next Singapore, I think it's time that we made the necessary sacrifices to be the next Singapore.
All right, thank you, Kitmina and Harini. We'll be right back after this short break. Welcome back to the Review 360. We're in conversation with Kitmina Hewage and Harini Veerasekara from the Institute of Policy Studies, who've authored a very interesting paper on economic reforms in Sri Lanka. Harini, two of the other key factors that you identify in your paper are misidentified reforms and deficient data accessibility. What do you mean when you say misidentified reforms?
Yeah, so when we say misidentified, what we mean is that there needs to be a better system by which you prioritize reforms within any kind of larger reform agenda. As we know, there are multiple or like a gamut of reforms that need to be kind of rolled out, and how do you do this in the most kind of practical and efficient way, such that some of these actually do see the light of day. So we think it's important to focus on reforms that are kind of low-hanging fruit, ones that are easier to garner political support and therefore easier to kind of push out. So to give an example, when it comes to the reforms associated with the IT sector, we see that providing free Wi-Fi is one reform that has kind of been brought about. But
it's a bit of a pipe dream, isn't it?
Right. So research actually suggests that in Sri Lanka, even though internet usage is low, it's relatively accessible and affordable compared to neighboring countries. So is this really the need of the hour? And should we focus more on things like using IT to make work hours more flexible, online payment mechanisms, government, making government procedures sort of digitalized? Those things are kind of low-hanging fruit, which we should capitalize on.
Kitmina, we've seen with successive governments, they come up with these policy roadmaps that eventually and expectedly fail to deliver on anything. We've got the Vision 2025 is the latest policy roadmap that we've gotten from this government. And in your article you refer to the prospective failure of Vision 2025 as well. Why?
It's two things. One is in terms of the institutional and structural barriers, the bottlenecks that we spoke about. So mainly in terms of ministerial misalignment and misidentified reforms, particularly in terms of the institutional excess. So what we see is that because there is so much to gain, and I think Vision 2025 has identified very important reforms that the economy needs to undergo. But in terms of implementing them, because there is so much fragmentation, because the ministries are stratified, it's very difficult to implement those reforms without kind of clashing into each other. There needs to be better coordination. So those structural changes tend to act as bottlenecks for that reform agenda, however good it may be in terms of implementation.
Let's talk about a simple reform in terms of fuel pricing that this government talked about. Not just this government, but even the previous government. talked about introducing a pricing formula for fuel. We've seen over the past few days the fuel prices per litre at IOC have increased. There hasn't been a corresponding increase as far as CPETCO is concerned. What do you gather from this fluctuation in fuel prices?
I think a formula for fuel pricing is something that is needed in the country because it establishes stability and it establishes certain confidence in the investors as well, because particularly those who are invested in Sri Lanka will have confidence that there will be some sort of stability in pricing rather than any ad hoc changes that may happen due to other reasons. So it's a necessary reform that has been proposed and is being discussed. Obviously there are certain, there's a political economy that undergoes, that is kind of underlying all of this, and that needs to be addressed, and that is not something that can be addressed overnight. Obviously the reforms that we talk about, or the kind of the solutions that we talk about here, are not things that can happen overnight, but rather will take some time for the political environment to change slowly, and particularly the institutional environment to change slowly as well.
Jaime, in your paper you write there is significant scope for reforms with little to no political costs. Even these reforms, however, are likely to be undermined by bottlenecks discussed above unless the government takes decisive steps to mitigate them. Are you hopeful that, or do you envision any kind of scenario in the near future where the government will take those decisive steps to mitigate them?
Right. So I think the process through which the government has come up with the reform agenda and the Vision 2025 plan, using kind of a more consultative process, inquiring from experts and so on, is a good start. So it's not all doom and gloom. I think it's a matter of kind of really focusing on some of the issues that we highlighted and not really worrying too much about the document per se. It's these underlying issues, despite kind of the government in power or the reform agenda that's in place. The underlying structure or the engine that pushes out reforms has to gradually change in order to...
There's a growing feeling among the public, among several economists that I've spoken to as well, that the government has at most another year and a half. Do you feel that they waited too long to, or that they're still waiting, to embark on these much needed reforms?
I think some reforms have already been implemented. So the Inland Revenue Bill, the Foreign Exchange Act and so on are important reforms that have already been undertaken by the government. I think in terms of the bigger reforms that are economic reforms for the doing business reforms or the investment climate reforms, those are things that will take some time. But I think particularly, like you said, at least for this government's remaining term, I think what we foresee is that they'll hopefully undertake the low-hanging fruit, like Harvey said. Things like making labor more accessible to women, making sure that those working conditions are more accessible to women, making sure that we can use IT in a more efficient manner for work, for example, from work-home programs and so on. So I think those sort of low-hanging fruit are things, and policies are things that won't cost too much political capital, won't generate too much controversy, but it's when you try and kind of reform for example, if you were to reform labor laws, then that might generate more controversy. So I think particularly given that we are moving into election in a couple of years.
Got a series of elections coming up.
I think it's more likely that governments undertake things that are bipartisan, reforms that are bipartisan, and we see this in other countries as well, and hopefully we see this with Sri Lanka moving over the next few years as well.
All right, Harini and Kitne, thank you very much once again for coming on the review. I hope to have you both back on the show once again, maybe in another year and a half, and we can see whether your prophesying has worked out. And that's a wrap of our program this week. I'll see you again, same time, same place next week. Don't forget to look us up on Facebook. You'll find us at BizFirst Review 360. I'm Nadim Majid. Good night and good luck.